Imagine waking up in a room smaller than most walk-in closets, sharing it with two other people on rotating shifts, never sleeping at the same time, never seeing daylight except during a 30-minute break that may or may not come, surrounded by 4,999 other human beings packed into a steel hull roughly the length of 3.5 football fields, floating somewhere in the middle of an ocean with no postal service, no grocery store, no hospital within 1,000 miles, and no ability to simply leave when the walls start closing in. And the question that should stop you cold is not how the carrier fights, but how 5,000 people are managed inside it without losing their minds, without losing their health, without losing the psychological order that keeps a floating city functional when the rest of the world is completely out of reach. The USS Gerald R. Ford is not simply a warship. It is a closed system designed to absorb a human population and sustain it indefinitely under conditions that would break most civilian infrastructure within days. And the most invisible, most engineered, most quietly remarkable part of that system is not its weapons array or its nuclear reactors, but the way it manages the one resource that runs out faster than food, faster than fuel, faster than medical supplies, space itself, and the human behavior that space either contains or destroys. Personal space aboard a Nimitz-class or Ford-class carrier is not a comfort allocation. It is a systems variable. It is calculated, assigned, enforced, and psychologically managed with the same precision applied to fuel load or flight deck operations, because the designers understood something that civilian architects rarely confront. When you remove the option to leave, the distance between people stops being a social preference and becomes a survival parameter. Here is what most people never consider. The average American home provides roughly 800 to 1,000 square feet per occupant. A sailor aboard the Gerald R. Ford operates within approximately 17 square feet of personal sleeping space. Not living space. Not personal space in any civilian sense. The rack, which is what the berthing unit is called, is a coffin-shaped sleeping pod, roughly 72 inches long, 24 inches wide, and 20 inches of vertical clearance above the mattress, with a small curtain that can be drawn shut, and a locker beneath or beside it for all personal belongings. This is not a temporary inconvenience. This is the design. It was engineered this way because the alternative, giving each sailor more room, would require either a larger ship, fewer sailors, or fewer systems, and all three of those options create a different category of failure. The ship needs its size for stability and flight operations. It needs its crew count to operate continuously across a 24-hour cycle, and it cannot sacrifice system space for comfort space because the systems are what keep everyone alive. So the rack becomes the solution, and the question becomes, how do you prevent 5,000 people living in 17 square foot sleeping pods from generating the kind of psychological friction that cascades into operational failure? The answer is a layered management architecture that most people never see because it operates below the level of visible command. Berthing aboard the Gerald R. Ford is organized by division, by department, and by watch rotation. And this is not an administrative convenience. It is a friction reduction mechanism. When berthing is organized so that people sleeping are never in the same space as people preparing to work, noise conflict drops, sleep quality improves marginally but meaningfully, and the low-grade aggression that emerges from interrupted rest is suppressed before it can compound. Sleep deprivation at scale is not an individual health problem on an aircraft carrier. It is a systems vulnerability. A sleep-deprived sailor on a flight deck makes an error that can destroy aircraft worth hundreds of millions of dollars or kill colleagues. A sleep-deprived technician in a reactor compartment introduces risk into a nuclear system that has no tolerance for human error. So the rack rotation, the practice of hot racking on older vessels, where multiple sailors share the same berthing unit across different shifts, is not just a space-saving measure. It is a risk distribution strategy. The Ford class has moved toward assigned racks per sailor, a design upgrade that came with measurable mental health benefits, and that decision was not made for comfort reasons. It was made because the data showed that personal rack assignment reduced interpersonal conflict, improved sleep duration, and decreased the frequency of behavioral incidents that required command intervention. Space, it turns out, is not just physical, it is behavioral infrastructure. But this creates a new vulnerability. If personal space is now allocated per sailor rather than shared, the ship must carry more berthing volume for the same crew size, which means that space was taken from somewhere else. And understanding where it came from requires understanding how the Ford's internal architecture differs from its predecessors. The Gerald R. Ford class introduced a fundamentally redesigned interior layout built around the principle of zonal separation, the idea that the ship's internal geography should reflect its operational logic rather than simply fill available volume. Berthing zones are now physically separated from work zones in ways that were not possible on older carriers, and passageways are designed to manage human traffic flow the way an urban planner manages vehicle density. This matters because on a ship with 5,000 people operating continuously, passageway congestion is not an inconvenience. It is a latency problem. When a damage control team cannot move through a passageway at speed because off-duty personnel are in transit, response time to a fire or a flooding event increases by seconds that can determine whether a contained incident becomes a catastrophic one. The layout of personal space is therefore inseparable from the layout of emergency response capability, and both are inseparable from the psychological stability of the population inside the hull. If you lived here, the thing you would notice first is not the noise or the heat or the confined sleeping quarters. It is the complete absence of unstructured time. Every minute aboard the Gerald R. Ford is organized. Watch schedules run in 6-hour rotations across a 24-hour cycle, meaning a sailor is always either on watch, in transit, eating, sleeping, or in a brief window of personal time that must be used for hygiene, maintenance of personal equipment, communication with family if bandwidth permits, and whatever psychological decompression the individual can manage in 45 minutes before the cycle resets. This is not military severity for its own sake. This is systems engineering. Unstructured time at scale aboard a confined vessel produces behavioral entropy. When thousands of people have nothing to do in a space too small to absorb undirected energy, conflict escalates, minor infractions accumulate, and the command structure begins spending disproportionate resources managing interpersonal breakdown rather than operating the ship. The schedule is the system. The schedule is what transforms a steel box containing 5,000 people into a functional organism. And here is where civilian logic collapses entirely. On land, the solution to crowding and psychological pressure is physical escape. You leave the building, you take a walk, you drive somewhere else. That option does not exist on the Gerald R. Ford. The ship may be at sea for 6 to 8 months. There is nowhere to go. So the engineering response to that constraint is to create controlled microenvironments within the hull that serve the same neurological function as physical escape, spaces where the density drops, the acoustic environment changes, and the cognitive pressure of operational work is briefly suspended. These spaces include dedicated recreation areas, many small gyms distributed across multiple decks rather than concentrated in one location to reduce congestion, chapel spaces that serve multiple religious denominations and also function as quiet rooms, and libraries that exist not primarily for reading but for the psychological value of a low-stimulation environment. None of these spaces are luxuries. Each one is a calculated investment in behavioral stability across a 200-plus day deployment. And each one was sized and located based on modeling of how 5,000 people in a closed system distribute psychological stress across time. The medical infrastructure aboard the Gerald R. Ford operates on the same design logic. It is not scaled to treat the injuries that typically occur. It is scaled to treat the injuries that occur when isolation, confinement, and sustained operational pressure are applied to a large population for months at a time. The ship carries full surgical capability, dental care, mental health professionals, and a pharmacy capable of supporting a small city, because the nearest alternative is hundreds or thousands of miles away. And a medical evacuation takes time the ship may not have, and bandwidth the mission may not allow. Mental health, specifically, has become a more explicitly engineered component of carrier design in recent decades, because the data accumulated from long deployments showed a clear pattern. Psychological incidents do not spike immediately upon departure. They follow a curve that peaks around the third and fourth month. When the novelty of deployment has worn away, the return date still feels distant, and the accumulated friction of confined living begins producing behavioral symptoms that, left unmanaged, escalate into operational liabilities. The Ford class incorporates behavioral health resources not as a supplementary service, but as a structural component of crew management, and the spaces allocated to those resources were taken from other uses in the design phase, because the systems analysts determined that the cost of those spaces in square footage was lower than the cost of behavioral breakdown in operational capability. This is where the pressure intensifies. Because everything described so far operates under the assumption of normal deployment conditions, meaning the ship is at sea, systems are functioning, resupply is theoretically possible, and communication with the outside world, however limited, remains available. But the Gerald R. Ford is designed to operate under conditions where none of those assumptions hold. Communication blackout is not a hypothetical contingency. It is a planned operational state. When the ship goes emissions controlled, meaning it stops broadcasting any signal that could reveal its position, the crew loses external communication entirely. No calls home, no internet, no news from the outside world. The ship disappears from the electromagnetic spectrum, and the 5,000 people inside it must continue functioning as though the world they left behind still exists and still matters. Operating on schedules and within systems that were designed to maintain psychological coherence even when external reference points are completely removed. The management of personal space during emissions-controlled operations becomes even more critical because the psychological anchors that normally distribute stress, contact with family, awareness of world events, the simple knowledge that someone outside the hull knows where you are gone. What replaces them is routine, structured, enforced, engineered routine that recreates the rhythm of normal deployment so accurately that the brain's orientation systems, which depend heavily on temporal and social regularity, continue functioning without the external inputs they would normally require: the rack, the watch, the meal, the brief recreation window, the rack again. This sequence, repeated across 200 days, is not just a schedule. It is the psychological infrastructure that keeps 5,000 people operational when the rest of the world has gone dark. If this system failed, if the scheduling infrastructure collapsed, if berthing assignments were disrupted by damage or flooding, if the controlled microenvironments became inaccessible, what would break first would not be morale in any abstract sense. What would break first is sleep. Sleep disruption at scale produces a cascade. Cognitive performance degrades within 48 hours. Error rates climb, interpersonal conflict accelerates, and the command structure, which depends on the reliable performance of thousands of individuals executing complex tasks simultaneously, begins to fracture at the edges. The ship does not stop functioning immediately, but its margin for error narrows. And an aircraft carrier operating with a narrowed margin for error in a contested environment is not a less effective weapons platform. It is a different category of risk entirely. One that the designers spent decades trying to engineer out of the system through berthing design, schedule architecture, medical infrastructure, and the quiet, invisible management of the space between human beings. What the USS Gerald R. Ford ultimately represents, when you trace its design logic all the way down to the dimensions of a sleeping rack and the placement of a quiet room 3 decks below the flight deck, is a complete theory of human sustainability under conditions that have no civilian equivalent. A theory that treats personal space not as comfort, but as a performance variable, not as a right, but as a systems requirement, not as an amenity, but as the foundational infrastructure upon which every other system aboard depends. Remove the weapons, remove the aircraft, remove the reactors. What remains is still a machine of extraordinary complexity. A machine designed to keep 5,000 human beings psychologically coherent, physically functional, and operationally capable for months at a time in complete isolation from the world that produced them. And the one system aboard the Gerald R, a Ford that has never been fully described in public documentation. The one layer of the management architecture that remains classified not for security reasons, but because the Navy itself is still refining it, is the predictive behavioral modeling system that monitors crew cohesion in real time and adjusts operational schedules to preempt the psychological pressure points before they become behavioral incidents. The question worth sitting with is this: if a ship this size can engineer the conditions for human psychological stability across 8 months of isolation, what would happen if those same design principles were applied to the systems where most people actually live?